Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to the ELPIS international event about the creative economy. My name is Christina Poutetsi, and I'm a journalist at the newspaper Tovima. Let me introduce to you our guest, Mr. Andrew Senior. Mr. Senior is a leading expert in the field of creative economy and is particularly interested in entrepreneurship and copyright. A lawyer in profession, he is an expert in cultural policy making and governance at UNESCO. He is also director at Andrea Senior Associates, and in 1999 he established the Creative Industries Unit at the British Council. He has an extensive experience in a range of emerging economies in Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America, working in national, state, and city governments, sector agencies, artists, creative businesses, and civil society. Now, for the next half hour, we are going to discuss how creative economy can get from theory into practice. That is, we will examine ways to develop creative entrepreneurship, focusing especially in the opportunities that lie ahead in Greece, and how young people can get involved. Before the end of the session, we will also have time for discussion and questions from the audience. So, Mr. Senior, welcome to Athens.
Thank you, Christina.
Creative entrepreneurship, is it a hidden treasure? How big a deal is this?
I think that the creative economy is a huge deal, and one which there's a danger that we fail to understand how much it is a game changer. I think we're actually living through a new industrial revolution. I think it's as important as that in actual fact, we're going through a period of change which is unprecedented in the past 200 years in terms of human history. It's a convergence, certainly in terms of the creative economy, of creativity and understanding all the things that Felipe was talking about in terms of the individual and individual creativity and the way in which collaboration and cooperation takes hold as far as the creative sector is concerned. It's also the way in which technology is changing things, but it's also now the way in which we've gone through the global crisis in economic terms. And one of the things that is emerging because of that is also the need to understand how business models are changing to respond to the creativity of individuals, but also to the way in which technology allows us to communicate and work across boundaries.
How can a creative idea become a successful business? What else is necessary? Can you give us an example?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that a creative idea very rarely simply becomes successful. A creative idea normally comes from one individual, but in actual fact, for a creative idea to really take hold and become successful in business terms, that becomes the collaboration and engagement of a whole range of different people. So if you think about J.K. Rowling, who is perhaps the most successful author living today, in actual fact, her success isn't just about her. It's about the editor that started editing her books. It's about the team at the publishing house, the marketing people at the publishing house who came up with the ideas about how they could actually position the book so they could get it into a public perception, how they could work with schools, with young people. It then becomes about how her agent started selling the rights, not just in terms of the publishing house, but looking at it in terms of film, in terms of video games. All these things are part of the success, and it's about her being able to work with those different players, yes, retaining creative control, but actually also about her being able to be prepared to work with individuals and understand that they had skills which needed to be brought to the fore. If she was going to be successful, if her ideas were going to reach the public in ways that she'd, I'm sure, never imagined when she sat in the cafe in Edinburgh writing the first manuscript of Harry Potter.
How can Greece enter the world of creative economy? What are the opportunities that arise in Greece?
I'll say now that I think Greece has already entered the world of the creative economy. The critical thing about the creative economy and the creative industries is that this is the only raw material in the world that was evenly spread around the world, human creativity. So this is not a question of nature, it's a question of nurture. The creative economy is here because you have that creativity here. It is entirely a question of how you go about developing it, how you go about putting in place the type of support, the type of engagement, the type of information which allows it to grow. Part of that is about the government. The government needs to play a role in this. And I can see that at the moment that isn't necessarily happening because the creative industries and the creative economy isn't understood by government, and that actually is critical. We were incredibly fortunate in the UK that Chris Smith was Secretary of State at the time that he was and brought those things to bear as far as the dialogue and the discussion, the intellectual discussion actually in the UK. And what Chris did, and we didn't touch on this, he's also responsible for creating the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts with David Putnam, the filmmaker. These have been critical factors in the development of the creative economy. There are roles that government or foundations can play, but government is critical to all of this. So I don't think this is something that doesn't exist in Greece. I think it is something which needs to be nurtured in Greece far more than it is being at the moment.
With the cooperation of the government and the private sector?
With the cooperation of the government, of the private sector, with the collaboration between cultural institutions, between artists, and working across boundaries. I think one of the problems is that we have developed a mentality in terms of the arts and in terms of creativity, which is that it is in silos, it's kept in a particular space. Our education has historically talked about you being trained to do one particular thing. But the thing about the creative industries today, and this is why it is such a major paradigm shift, is that actually to be successful, you have to be able to engage with people with very different types of skills. I think that, when we start talking about skills and training, one of the most important things to understand is we're in a period when skills and training is not just about young people. It's also about older people, because one of the things that the crisis has created is a generation of older people who are not going to be able to retire and rely upon state pensions when they're expected to be able to do so. But what that also means is that we're in which is why it's so exciting, we're at a point when the skills, particularly of young people, in terms of how they understand and can use technology, can be married with the experience of older people to create a different type of relationship within our societies. One which is actually potentially far more fruitful, because it actually speaks to the skills and strengths of everybody. And that's what I think, part of what needs to be nurtured is a dialogue which cuts across sectoral boundaries, but also cuts across generational boundaries. Because really this is about, and I know it sounds crude and economic in this sense, it's about getting the most out of the resources we have. But flip that on its head, and it's actually about giving people the opportunity to be the best that they can possibly be.
Mm-hmm. How can creative entrepreneurship be implemented in a local economy, and how can it support an underdeveloped rural area?
As I said, creativity is there in every community.
Mm-hmm.
It is spread across the world. So the concentration may not be as great in a place which is less populated, but it is still there. The critical thing today, as far as the creative economy is concerned, is actually access to the internet, because that is the principal vehicle through which ideas and dialogue, communication, collaboration is able to take place. So if you're able to have the fat pipes which allow large data to be passed between different places, all of a sudden you're able to be working with somebody here in Athens, in London, in Sao Paulo, across the world in that way, which means that you're able to find the most skilled people, the people who are innovating in different ways, and be able to work with them. And if you're able to do that, then all of a sudden it means that you have more competitive, you're more competitive in the marketplace. The problem for people who live in an area like the west of Cork in Ireland, or one of the islands on the coast here, or in the far north of Scotland. I've just done a piece of work with the Hans and Islands up there, looking at a strategy for them. The great difficulty that they have is that they don't have high-speed broadband access. And that immediately puts them at a disadvantage with somewhere like London. So if I'm developing an app in London, I have 4G around me. When I'm thinking about what I'm doing, I'm thinking about it in real time, in the real context of how people will be able to use it in London. And that's where there is a big market immediately. If you're trying to do that somewhere which doesn't really have particularly good 2G, you're immediately at a disadvantage. So one of the critical things to my mind is that we have to understand that access to high-speed broadband is actually a critical factor in terms of economic development and social development and cultural development in terms of our peripheral communities. And that, to my mind, is one of the things which, if we want Europe to be as competitive as possible, we need to be working in that way. Because at the same time, there is something about living in a remote rural region which does mean that you think about things in a different way. And part of the joy of that is that actually you want different ways of thinking to be brought into the way in which we're trying to develop new products, new services, as far as the creative sector is concerned. And so the innovation is going to come from different types of collaboration, which historically were not possible, but which technology allows us to facilitate.
Are there examples?
There are lots of examples of creative businesses that are beginning to develop on the margins, but where they are able to use technology to kind of spread out. So, for example, in Brazil, there is an area that is quite a large city, but historically wouldn't have been somewhere that you would think about being able to collaborate globally, in a city called Recife. And they have taken their old port and, through a process of regeneration, have created a digital port, which is now where there are a whole series of creative and digital businesses, technology businesses, actually based and working together. And it's that sort of innovation, that sort of understanding of the way in which the creative sector needs to be able to work with technology in other sectors, which I think is important. Because the other thing is, one of the things that we talked about a lot in terms of the work with the Highlands and Islands was the need to be able to put in one place people who were able to share experiences. The whole question, Stuart mentioned the issue of mentoring and peer mentoring. One of the things you want is, you're not, as a creative person, going to have all the business skills, but you want to have access to people who do have business skills. So it may well be that in the course of 10 people sitting around the table, somebody may know enough about marketing to help you to ask the difficult questions of somebody who's actually a marketing expert. Because if you look at many creative businesses, one of the problems is, particularly those that grow, is that they don't necessarily have the skills and they don't think about the business skills from the outset. So that many of you, I don't know how many of you will own them, but many of you will have come across Jimmy Choo shoes. You know, Jimmy Choo, Malaysian guy who went to Cordwainers, to one of the London Institutes, the University of the Arts London's colleges or constituent parts, and did his degree course there and started to design shoes. He then got a very rich financial backer, which all of a sudden meant that his business could grow. She then got rid of him, but kept the name. So when you see Jimmy Choo, you're not looking necessarily at something which Jimmy Choo has actually produced. It's his name, it was his creativity. But of course, he then was faced with kind of, what do I do now? He had to think about it. But if he'd been able to be advised from the outset about the contract he was entering into, it would have been a different story. In the same way that you hear time and time again about musicians who sign up to big labels and sign contracts because they want that exposure, but which at the end of the day really provide them with relatively little return. And it is critically important in terms particularly of incubation that yes, you have the technology, but you're also giving people access to the advice which they need to help them and support them in making the best decisions in terms of how they go about developing their business.
About this subject, is there a need for a legal framework about intellectual property?
In terms of copyright, I think we have, you know, copyright is a system which was created to respond to a very particular situation, which was an argument between the Scots and the English, which were, you know, these are long-held things. But in actual fact, it was really about the Age of Enlightenment. And it was the point where Scotland was growing and wanting to have access to information, but where in actual fact, in London, the people that were holding because they were the people that had been stationers, they'd written out the documents in earlier times and made sure that there were authentic copies that were being created. They were holding on to that right. Even though the printing press had come along and the world was changing, they'd hold on to that right. And they were restricting access to information for the Scots. And the Scots were saying, well, we're going to break this. We don't think this is right. And so they broke the rules. And the Parliament then had to come up with a system which meant that those rules could be broken, but at the same time, the people that were creating work and were owning work actually were able to take a revenue from it. I don't think things have changed fundamentally. I still think it's imperative that if you are an artist, you have to be able to find a mechanism for being paid for what you produce and when that work gets into the public domain. Not everything that an artist creates is going to have economic value. But as soon as it has economic value, you need to be able to leverage from that value a return for yourself. At the same time, there is a difficulty which I think has come about largely because of the way in which large corporations, particularly Walt Disney in the States, have looked at the issue of copyright, and they've pushed and lobbied the American Senate and House of Representatives into a situation whereby they have constantly extended the length of copyright protection, which means that Mickey Mouse now, you know, is still protected, even though under most historic regimes, it would have been a situation where he would have gone out of protection and people could have been using that creativity to build on it. The irony is, of course, that Mickey Mouse was built on the creativity of somebody else because the original character was called Steamboat Willie. And so I think that, there are faults in the current copyright system as far as I'm concerned, particularly in terms of the length of term, but fundamentally it is the best system we have. And we have to look at what it means and how we go about developing it and maintaining it and managing it in the context of a technological age. Because that is actually the greatest threat as far as creativity is concerned, is that people can simply download things and don't see the value of what is being created there. To my mind, one of the real problems is that very often, in a way, artists are driven by, yes, they want to put bread on the table, food on the table, but at the same time they also want to see their work out there and being enjoyed and consumed by people for as long as possible. And so actually quite often, people want to see it reach a large audience, so they will sign a deal in that way. But I think there is a real need for us to be far more cautious about what we're signing, getting the best possible advice, looking at the experience of people and learning from that experience, rather than going and making mistakes that actually you don't need to make.
In Greece, tourism is a very important sector for growth. Could you elaborate on the opportunities, the business opportunities and the synergies that may be developed between creative industry, tourism and culture?
Yes. Chris kind of touched upon this earlier on, that tourism itself isn't part of the creative industries, but there are very strong links between tourism and the creative and cultural sector in that way. I think that there are great opportunities, but it is also potentially an issue that may constrain you. One of the problems with the tourist market is that there is a tendency to market a country on the basis of its heritage, not in terms of a contemporary understanding of that society. And so there's a real need, in my view, to be able to think about what this means in terms of the creative industries. Because the difficulty with a heritage-based creative sector is that quite often you don't really want to see too much innovation. You want it to stay where it is. And of course, that might be fine for a tourist who comes here and buys a piece of an artifact of some sort that's been created with reference to the past in that way. But does that mean they're going to go back and buy more of it? Are they going to be consumers? Are you building an ongoing market as far as those individuals are concerned? And critically, to my mind, you need to be able to think about how in the context of tourism, you're responding not just to bringing people in because of the heritage you have here, but also because of the innovation and the energy of contemporary Greece. And that's where you need to have, in my view, a shift in terms of talking about tourism. Because at the moment, we were talking about wine last night at dinner, and I think most people in the UK, and the UK drinks an awful lot of wine. We're one of the largest consumers in the world, but most people in the UK, if you ask them about wine, and Greece, they would talk about Retsina. They'd have no other experience. And there is just this need to shift that paradigm in terms of the way in which this country is perceived to really allow it to flex its muscles in terms of the creative economy. It's not to say, I'm not saying you abandon your culture for one moment, but you need to be able to see how your culture and heritage are a tool which can be used to tell stories which actually have wider resonance. I've done a lot of work in places where their markets have been about a local market, a regional market, a diaspora market. And all those markets have been markets which are really about wanting the same old things. We don't really want things to change. We're happy with where things are. But the thing is, as soon as if you want to break beyond the domestic market, you really need to be able to look at this in terms of what sort of resonance does this have in global terms? How do I make this a universal story which everybody can understand? It doesn't mean that you change the story, it just means that you make it something which in actual fact has a narrative which speaks to somebody who is consuming this in Australia or in Indonesia or in India. So that all of a sudden it is something which they're able to engage with as well. The Americans have been incredibly successful at doing it, but I don't think there's any reason why Greece and other parts of Europe and other parts of the world shouldn't be able to do it as well.
How friendly is this creative environment for young people?
I mentioned before the whole question of young people and old people and the respect and the cross-generational conversation. The thing about young people is they understand technology instinctively. If you have a problem with your computer and you have children, you know very well that one of the first people you have to ask is, this isn't working, how do I get it to work? And I think that the critical thing that we have to understand is that children today, particularly those that have grown up through the crisis, don't have the same aspirations that we necessarily had, all the expectations in terms of life. Many of us were, I was certainly born into a post-war generation which I expected the welfare state to function in a very particular way, to have all sorts of support from the state. But what we can see today is that actually those certainties aren't the certainties which another generation is going to have, whether or not we as a generation are going to have those certainties. And therefore, for young people today, I think that they don't want to be constrained and to think in the way that their parents and their grandparents' generation thought and acted. They're looking for new opportunities. They're not frightened of a conversation which is about enterprise or about entrepreneurship. And it's interesting that, that to my mind, they're a generation which is prepared to take risks that we wouldn't have been prepared to take. One of the things that I often, it's a slight tangent, I apologize, one of the things that I often get quite concerned about is when we start talking about entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship in many ways is a very specific thing. Quite often what we're talking about is actually start-up businesses. People who start up businesses aren't necessarily entrepreneurs. I think a lot of people, especially at a time like this, set up businesses because actually they're trying to find a way of providing for a better future for their children and their families. And one of the things that you have to do if you're an entrepreneur is to take risk. If you set up a business where you're trying to create a better life for your family, you get to a point where you achieve that, and I question whether or not you then want to take that risk. Because you don't want to risk the fact of being able to allow your family, the kids to go to the school that you want to go to, your parents to be able to have the sort of care that they need to get as they get older. All those things are important for you. And I think you weigh it up, and in the balance of things, you don't take any further risk. But an entrepreneur will do. An entrepreneur will take that further risk. And to my mind, we need to be entrepreneurs, particularly as far as the creative sector are concerned, I think are hugely misunderstood because we see that and it becomes a negative. We see entrepreneurship as being something which is, these are bad people within society. But part of the paradigm shift that I think we have the potential to affect today, because we are talking about this industrial revolution, to my mind is actually challenging the way in which people think about entrepreneurship. There is a social good in being an entrepreneur and creating jobs, because not everybody can create their own business or be a self-employed. So we need to understand that actually entrepreneurs are important as far as our society is concerned, and in terms of employment and in terms of people being able to have fulfilling lives. What we need to be able to do is to ensure that in terms of entrepreneurship, that there is a far stronger relationship between the entrepreneur and the society within which they're living. And I think that the thing about creative people and people who are creative entrepreneurs is that in a way they're predisposed to working and thinking in that way. Now, I believe that, but I don't believe that that necessarily has been manifested so far in terms of many of the creative businesses that have come through. But that's about the paradigm shift. I was having a conversation with some people a couple of days ago about the publishing industry in London, where one woman was talking about the fact that she was finding it very difficult to persuade them to put a mixed-race character on the cover of her book because the publishing house was saying it won't sell. Now, of course, I don't believe that's true for one moment. I don't think anybody in the UK really cares about that stuff anymore. The real problem is that if you go and look at a publishing house in the UK, yes, there are far more, it's a very female-friendly environment, but how many black faces do you see in the publishing house making decisions? Very, very few. And yet, actually, if you want to be able to expand your market, if you want to be able to engage, you need to be looking at how you go about creating dialogues with people that would not otherwise be your consumers. It's about building new markets. So I think this, that actually part of what will drive creative entrepreneurship to be more engaged with society and the communities it's working with is actually the self-interest of being able to build new markets. And I think that, is one of the ways in which this is, again, that paradigm shift in terms of the way in which society and business come together. And through the creative industries and through the driver that is creativity, the innovation that comes from creativity, we start to really see the fruits of a new industrial revolution.
Thank you very much,
My
Mr.
pleasure.
Senior, for your very useful insight. And hopefully it will inspire creative ideas that will become successful in business.
I hope so too.